Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast. We have a kind of a return to equilibrium on a few fronts right now. Last night we had a kind of a smattering of primary elections last night. There was one in Wyoming, one in Alaska, not states that we normally think of as like kind of like national barn burners, but through kind of weird idiosyncrasies in this cycle, they do kind of turn out to be. And we're going to talk about that. Liz Cheney obviously went down to defeat. That was the most predicted defeat in like ever. Although, when you have things like Kansas happen in these races that are kind of quirky, right? Where you have a race, it's not a basic Republican Democrat race in a state where, pollsters have a good grasp of how elections work. In Kansas, again, that was a unique contest for a lot of different reasons. It was a little hard to poll, and there weren't that many polls. Um, so, to me, at least, there was always. I kind of thought there. I certainly did not expect Liz Cheney to win that primary contest, but I thought there was an outside chance that, like, she might do better than people thought, or something like that. Obviously, that did not happen. She went down to defeat as expected, and you have the attempted return to politics of Sarah Palin, blast from the past, um, kind of in some ways kind of the John the Baptist, female John the Baptist of crazy, right? Kind of anticipates so many current players, and as often happens in those cases, her ideological and affective progeny, she can't necessarily compete with them. They outdo her at the at her game. So we're going to talk about those two things. Another interesting thing that is happening right now is, I've been sort of banging this drum for a couple months that either the Democrats' prospects in the midterm elections were better than was being suggested, or that there were things that Democrats could do to improve their standing. And something that we have seen over the last month or so, there has been kind of a sea change in expectations about the outcome of the midterm election. I would say it is now the consensus opinion that Democrats are likely to maintain their control of the Senate, and possibly even add a seat or two in the Senate. Obviously, those are, we're still 3 months out. A lot can happen, but it's very different from the expectation even at the beginning of the summer, which was basically that the Democrats were going to get crushed across the board in the House and the Senate, and almost there was kind of like no hope, like maybe just find a different hobby than politics, or or something, right? Or find a different country or something like that. But that set of expectations has changed pretty dramatically. And the thing that I always follow as kind of the canonical metric is the generic ballot. That is the poll question, where, with slightly different permutations, they ask, all things being equal, either would you like the Democrats or Republicans to control Congress next cycle, or all things being equal, do you plan on voting for do you plan on voting for a Democrat or a Republican when you vote for House, or some version like that. And that has moved uh, 3 or 3+ points over the last couple months, give or take, from Republicans being ahead, somewhere in the ballpark of 2.5 to 3 points, to now the Democrats being ahead about half a point. Now, if we think about single polls, those are obviously very small differences, right? Well within like the margin of error or whatever, there are different margins besides margins of errors, but that we know. When you're talking though about averages of dozens of polls and tens or hundreds of thousands of respondents, then those numbers become pretty significant. So there's been that change. So we've moved away from the red wave narrative. And now I think we're kind of like, well, okay, there's no red wave, but Republicans still are in a you know a better position than Democrats, certainly for the House. And so you're in this kind of like liminal space now where there's been a big move, but how big a move is it going to be? Is it really going to be enough? I mean, it seems like it's going to be enough. I'm fairly confident that Democrats are going to hold the Senate. We're going to talk about some of those races in a few moments. The House is a different thing. A lot of ingrained advantages. Although even there was I what was it? It was it in you probably know, Kate. There was a special election or a primary. I can't remember. I think it was in Minnesota. Um, a contest. I think it was last week, and basically it's one of these races where I think the Democrat lost, but it was one of these kind of bellwetherish constituencies, and the Democrats just sort of overperformed for no particular good reason. And that gave a lot of prognosticators kind of pause, like maybe this idea that you know the Republicans have the wind at their back, even if a little less than we thought a couple months ago, maybe that's just wrong. Maybe that's just not the case. So we're going to talk about those things. These sort of equilibriums resetting in. We'll probably even get to a little bit of a totally different kind of equilibrium, which, as we have seen in the past, that we have somewhat gotten over the initial shock of the fact that uh, the former president's home, or I mean, it's very if you think about it, we haven't talked about enough. It is very Trump that Trump sells high dollar memberships to his house. Who does that, right? Like most of us, like we do, got a lot of money making angles, but like giving memberships to our house is not one of them. In any case, we've sort of gotten over the shock of the fact that there was this, raid and search, and now it's kind of as so often with Trump, it's become okay. Yeah, I mean, his house got raided, and now we're kind of, the Republicans are coming up with their excuses and this, that, and the other. So we're going to talk about all those things. But before we do, let me remind you that Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee is a sponsor of the Josh Marshall podcast. If you can't handle the heat, get back to the kitchen, because with a glass of Grady's New Orleans style cold brew in your hand, you'll be ready to tackle whatever sweaty situations pop up this summer. If your previous attempts at cold brewing were messy, bitter, or bland, don't worry. Grady's makes cold brew consistent, easy, and mess free. Their beanbag cold brew kit provides everything you need to make the perfect cup of iced coffee at home. And there's no need to buy any special coffee gadgets. You can brew right inside the Grady's store and pour pouch and enjoy tasty iced coffee all summer long. Summer proof your fridge today at Grady'sColdBrew.com. You can use promo code TPM to save 25% off. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay, so co-host Kate Riga, what's going on?
So let's start with Liz Cheney's defeat. As you say, pretty much the most predictable that we've had of late. Her campaign kind of did this half hearted thing of like asking Democrats in the state to switch their registration so they could vote for her in the primary. And there is some, evidence from the state numbers that thousands of people did that.
Right.
Um, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't really expected to be enough. She's, getting clobbered. I mean, she didn't even really campaign in a way that would suggest that she thought her candidacy had any real shot. She wasn't spending that much time in Wyoming. Um, because of the preponderance of death threats she's received, she wasn't even really holding public events.
I mean, that's really chilling. It's
Yeah,
really chilling. Yeah.
exactly. So they ultimately, the networks and AP kind of called the race all about like an hour and 20 minutes after the polls closed yesterday. She came out and did the concession speech, like even before AP had called it, clearly not really waiting with bated breath. And then in the speech, mixed in some kind of tantalizing I may run in 2024 nuggets, did some of her kind of classic I will do anything to keep Trump from being in the Oval Office, there are things bigger than holding onto your house seat, blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. um and then we get our our flurry of pieces, headline variations of, Cheney's House career is over, what's next, kind of thing. um but one thing that's funny that I kind of found out about while I was writing our pre-write is that I didn't know very much about the woman who beat her, who's going to take the seat on now, Harriet Hageman, this lawyer who kind of got the Trump endorsement and has gone full MAGA. But interestingly, she was among the Republicans kind of fighting Trump's ascendancy in 2016 and was brainstorming ways to kind of have a live vote on the floor of the convention to take away his nomination.
Yeah.
Prior to that, she'd worked as an advisor on Cheney's kind of short lived 2014 Senate campaign. So it does add a layer of almost like literary depth to this race that you have these two women who took literally the exact inverse path in their politics. Cheney supported Trump in 2016. She didn't really have her change of heart until the insurrection. And then meanwhile, you have Hageman, who was fighting Trump's ascendancy and then was like, well, that's no way to win a statewide seat. So she had a change of heart and then off they split.
Now I knew that she had been, anti-Trump in the past, and it's one of those things. It's sort of there's something very revealing about Trump, that being, hardcore against Trump in the past is no obstacle.
Nope.
As long as you make, as long as you pledge total fealty, you're good to go. In a way that other sort of more normal politicians, if you really went against them in the past, you're never coming back. You may kind of make up in a way, but you're never going to be tight, right? That's
Hmm.
never going to happen. And we've seen again and again. I don't think it's something positive. I mean, in some ways, since everybody started off against him, he kind of can't.
Right.
He's
That's
he's
true.
got to he's got to take what he can get. But there's more than that, right? I mean, you've got like Lindsey Graham, who was
Hmm.
the one in 2016, just the absolute anti-Trump. What that he has that famous line. If we buy into Trump, we will be destroyed and will deserve to be destroyed. So there is this. There's something there, and I think at some level it is he turns on everybody, then unturns on everybody. So I think in part he doesn't, to him, I think through his prism, what you say is just what seemed to work for you at that given moment. I don't think he really thinks that you ever thought it, right? Or unthought it or thought anything. Everything's transactional, everything's mutable. So, if you are making a blood pledge, come on board. It's all good.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's such a profound reflection of his own idea of loyalty. He doesn't get kind of offended at this idea that people were once railing against him because he has no intention of maintaining lifelong loyalty to anyone.
Yeah.
So, that's just not even like the framework within which he operates.
Yeah, no,
Um,
it's revealing at a number of levels. I mean, one so here's a question. So she hinted 2024,
mhm,
presumably a presidential run.
mhm,
Now, I saw a number of people saying, well, is she really going to, be a spoiler, third party, blah 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 blah, if she's really trying to kind of prevent Trump. I didn't see that particular part of the speech, but I at least interpreted that as you run in the primary. That
mhm.
makes total sense to me. I mean, she can get the money. There's no question she can get the money. I mean, she may get it all from Democrats, but she can get the money to run, right? And I suspect, there's plenty of Republican money out there. There may not be Republican voters, but there are, Republicans of a sort, blah 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 blah, and that um, we don't know what that primary battle is going to be like. We don't even know if there's going to be a primary battle, really. We kind of talk about that and DeSantis and this person and that person, but as with everything in Trump world, that's all or nothing. Like you're going to go there. You're not going to enter that race unless you were there to beat Trump and really run him out of politics for good. Right? The guy's almost 80. He's not going to like come back in a decade for after being out of office for a while. So this is it, and it's all or nothing. So I think if you're a DeSantis or maybe some other kind of like a Nikki Haley type,
Mm.
you you run in a primary where Trump is running. Your calculus is either I win or I'm done. I'm done in the Republican Party, or at least maybe not. Maybe I don't have to win, but he has to lose, right? Like if you're Nikki Haley, you're like, okay, maybe DeSantis wins, and I'm his vice presidential candidate or something like that. But Trump wins, you're done. You are done. And so, but assuming that primary happens, that would, what if she's on every debate stage? Not just kind of, doing DeSantis like criticisms, like you didn't, you were too much of a softy with Tony Fauci, of kind of saying, look, this guy tried to overthrow the government. I still think that's a problem. I mean, that is something she could really be a thorn in his side. And I can't, I don't, maybe she'd run as a third. I have no idea, but the primary thing seems like the obvious thing to me.
Totally. I've seen a lot of people kind of reacting on Twitter and being like, she's just going to siphon off votes from the Democrat. But I totally agree with you. Like, that's a pretty elementary calculation that I'm sure she and the pro Cheney camp have made. I had the same sense that if primaries are allowed in the Republican
Right.
Party, which is not
Right.
a given, um, yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's under the delusion that a Cheney candidacy would suddenly split the MAGA diehards, but I absolutely think there's something to be gained by forcing him and DeSantis and whatever kind of proto Trumps there are to have to share space with a voice of someone who's like reasonable and responsible and won't let them just kind of squiggle away from the harms they've done. And at the very least, like you say, even if she ends up winning 2% of the vote and not hurting him at all, at least she'll be there as like an omnipresent fact check. And like you say, taking some resources. And that's a real thing because there are a lot of like super rich Republicans who are not on the Trump train.
Yeah, totally, totally. And the way the campaign finance system works these days, you just have like three rich guys, cover the whole cover the
Right.
whole budget basically. And I do think I would not be surprised if she could consistently get 5 to 10% of the primary vote.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's not enough to win anything. In a lot of states, it's not even enough to get any delegates because there's a strong, kind of winner take all element to the way that things are structured. Um, but she will clearly have the non-Trump thing 100% to her.
Hmm.
100%. She'll probably have some independents. There are obviously there are a lot of states where independents can vote in a Republican primary. New Hampshire is a good example of that. So it would not be surprising to me if she can actually get a significant percentage of the vote, just because it's not like there are zero anti-Trump Republicans. They're just not, you know, they're just in an extreme minority. But in a if it's anything like a normal presidential primary, you start out with like 7 or 8 people,
Hmm.
and like 10-15% maybe is a lot. Is a lot. So
Totally.
yeah.
Well, and I just think the idea in and of itself is powerful. The idea that you would have someone kind of like telling the truth within the Republican bubble, just because that is something that we
And
found.
not just the bubble, the stage.
Yeah,
On the
exactly.
stage. Yeah, yeah.
Because we've found just like mainstream media is like ill-equipped to handle Trump. Like we've seen that over and over and over again. And so kind of counting on her to be constantly reminding people of January 6th versus counting on, the New York Times to kind of not write a Trump friendly framed story just feels like a safer bet for everyone involved.
Well, and yeah, and just to state the obvious that a primary run is, you know, all damage to Trump, no, kind of playing with fire at the general election, and running in the general election is all zero danger to Trump and all playing with fire, right? So the
Exactly.
calculus is completely night and day. If I were her, like, why not? Why?
Exactly.
What else does she have better to do, frankly? And because she look, there's all this stuff about, oh, you say she's so great now, but like she was for the Iraq War, and she was okay. Yes, 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 yes. But I give her credit, right? And a lot of people give her credit, and I'm sure she doesn't mind getting the credit. So who wouldn't want to, kind of like milk that credit for at least a couple more years? Like what better thing does she? And the thing is with Trump, so much of Trumpism is all or nothing,
Hmm.
and so much of the optics of Trump are everybody bowing down to him. We got very used to uh, during Trump, he had all those people point out to me that bill signings are a little the same, but we had that constant visual Trump sitting behind the desk and everybody else, not just like, the champion Boy Scouts who were there to meet the president, but big important people standing behind him while he spoke. That's just there's an optics to that, and so much of the way he does press conferences or just anything, the idea of like Trump is up there on a stage with someone who is like telling him to fuck himself basically is just we have not seen that is not something that he can really um that he can really manage, and in some ways that's that's why the 2020 setup was really kind of all or nothing, right? And if anything, none of them, they all kind of knew where things were going, and they were all sort of at war with themselves in terms of like, I'm going to be the one who takes down Trump, but like every, all of our voters like Trump, so how am I gonna? I can't like disrespect him or
Right.
whatever. So that's my
Totally.
sense of that.
Yeah, and as to the point you made about like she supported the Iraq War, like she's this like intensely conservative politician. I mean, it's just it doesn't have to be a hagiography, It's like that's our weird take towards politicians that like the same thing I remember this so clearly was happening with Cassidy Hutchinson when she testified, and like I don't know, like the Jennifer Rubins of the world were kind of being like, "Oh, what an incredibly admirable, like heroic blah 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 blah." And it's just like multiple things can be true about someone at the same time, And like you can just kind of abhor all of Liz Cheney's politics and also acknowledge that she is incredibly courageous and this about this singularly important issue and willing to toss away, her current political career for it without also doing the whole like Bill Crystal thing of like a Cheney Buddha judge ticket. What do we think about that?
Well, it's also there's as part of that whole discourse, there's also this thing you see Republicans saying this a lot now, and we've seen in other contexts, like, oh, they love Liz Cheney now, but you watch her run for something, they will turn on her and beat her up, and it's like just like they did McCain, just like they did Romney. Well, first of all, there's so much mythologizing there because like Democrats really were not mean to McCain or even to Romney. They said they said Romney was a rich out of touch guy, and he is a rich out of touch guy. I mean, that's politics, right? But like as you said, there's no contradiction of saying great admiration for what she's doing now. She holds political views that I strongly disagree with. So if and when she was running in a race against a Democrat, I would oppose her. I would say her positions are terrible. There's nothing contradictory about
Right.
that at all. At all. There's nothing, nothing, and nothing, and nothing. And I would say to the people who say, like, oh, yeah, you love her now. What about the Iraq War? What about this? What about that? Well, you know, it's some things are just much more important than other things. They're in a different plane of importance. And as many people have argued in similar contexts over the last year, the integrity of the state itself and the democratic process itself is at a different level of importance than all the different policy disagreements, even though they are profoundly important in themselves. And you can't take that, it's sort of like, oh, he's remarkably healthy, except for the cancer, right? I mean, there's, certain things are just in a different category, right? There's no except. It's a big thing. So, it's just, I feel like we all understand each other. She is on the right side of this. This is kind of the issue of the day. And, I think we all understand each other.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the other big races of last night, which took place in Alaska. We can start with the Senate level, where Murkowski is the first of the Senate 7 who voted to convict Trump during the second impeachment to face a primary. And interestingly, her situation was totally different than Cheney's, solely because in 2020, Alaskans in a ballot referendum decided to kind of institute a new voting method for their elections, which entails in the primaries, top 4 candidates from any party go on to the general, and then in the general, you do ranked choice voting to determine the winner. So yesterday was just the primary, not a lot of drama. Murkowski was like almost certain to get through. Her real challenge will come in the general when she's running against this like former land commissioner in Alaska who's got the Trump endorsement, who's gone big lie, all of I guess what a traditional Republican now is.
Well, like the
Um,
Hegeman woman, and it's very,
exactly.
he always finds these mid-tier, someone who was such and such commissioner or this or
Hmm.
that and the other, who, it's almost like he's dangling like a little piece of candy.
Yeah.
Who's gonna grab it, right? So yeah, one of those
Yep.
people.
Exactly. And, interestingly, the ranked choice might end up helping Murkowski a lot too, because, so not only did the system let her avoid kind of a head to head with this far right person in the primary, which, would have been dangerous because primaries almost always attract a more extreme segment of the politician, a more kind of intensely partisan segment. And in this case, would have been more conservative than the general election body. But then when we get to the general and have the ranked choice, the Democrat is like not really a serious contender, basically a former educator who was going to run for some state level seat. And then the Alaska Democratic Party was like, nope, we need you for this one. So, and she hasn't really fundraised or anything. So she'll be knocked out of ranked choice fairly quickly. And then Team Murkowski is kind of banking on Murkowski is, really the only one of the only kind of genuinely moderate lawmakers we have left who does cross the aisle and who's crossed it on some very high profile things. So, she's maintained, I think, a fairly good relationship with Democrats in the state. So she can probably safely expect to scoop up some of those second or third place votes as people get eliminated. Um, and that might be enough to see her through. She's proven before to be a pretty formidable campaigner based on the 2010 when she got knocked out of the primaries by a Tea Party candidate and won with a write-in campaign. I still
Which is
find that
completely,
shocking.
completely unheard of. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not even. I mean, it's so hard. I mean, everybody. We talk so much about the various ways that politicians make voting hard. Kind of make it complicated, make you got to do this, you got to bring ID, all the kind of things. In this case, the person isn't even on the ballot. You've got to remind everybody, actually, the choices you have, don't choose any of them, and here's a weird name. I mean,
That you have to
it's
spell right.
yeah, you have to spell right. As it happens, it's a very, it's a political dynasty
Mhm.
in Alaska. But it was a huge, and that this is the thing with, you know, Wyoming is, you know, just everybody's a Republican
Mhm.
basically. And among Republicans, they tend to be all extreme. you know Now there's extreme and extreme. They range from, like, Liz Cheney to people in armed compounds. But so that's Wyoming. But Alaska is very strange. On the one hand, it has always been a solidly Republican state. It's one of the most solidly Republican states in the country. I think I was reading some article about these races last night and noticed that Biden got over 40% in 2020.
Mhm.
And that was like the highest a Democrat has gotten since, I think, like 1968. So, I
Who's
mean,
not an incumbent, yeah.
well, for presidential.
Yeah, only
Or
Obama the second time
Oh,
did
got
it
it.
as
Okay. So,
well.
oh,
But
okay.
yeah.
Well, in any case, so the point is that it just shows you, like, it is a thoroughly Republican state. And yet, it's thoroughly Republican. Most thoroughly Republican states send back extremely conservative senators. Murkowski's obviously not an extremely conservative senator, and the earlier senators were not extremely. Ted Stevens. He had a lot of. You get into Ted Stevens and Murkowski's father, who she kind of inherited the Senate seat from. Both of them at this point kind of from different political eras, but not neither ideologues. I mean, some of
Mhm.
that is because Alaska is extremely dependent on federal largesse, right? On if you want to call it pork or whatever, it's an undeveloped area. So that is part of it. But the ideology is weird too. You do have Democrats who have won there as recently as Mark Begich, who, what, I think he lost in 2014, maybe. I can't remember exactly when. In any case, they've had Democratic senators relatively recently, and you've got a lot of Democrats, and the kind of the character of republicanism there is not like, kind of evangelical stuff. It's
Mhm.
more kind of like, you know I've got my cabin and my shotgun, and don't talk to me, kind of kind of republicanism, which is I jest. It is it is a very libertarian kind of republicanism, which in a national context can go in various different directions. Um, One thing, I mean, the other thing about it is, as TPM alum Eric Kleefeld likes to point out, they essentially have state socialism there. They've got this system where they sell all the oil, and everybody gets cut a check each year. Literally, they have public ownership. I mean, it's a little more complicated with the licenses and stuff like that, but everybody in the state gets cut a check each year, and not like for $10, like for real money. Given it is kind of like an outback kind of state, where if you want to, you can, kind of go, I was going to say go feral, kind of just live off the land. There are people who just live on those checks, right? So it's a weird state. Its Republican Democratic thing is, it's different from the rest of the country.
Yeah, I think that's totally true, and is interesting because it adds a layer of question marks, I think, to this, like, very intriguing idea that rejiggering elections like this, doing ranked choice and, top 2 or top 4, I think pretty clearly has the potential to defang this trend of super, super extreme right person in the primary knocking out someone with any sense of moderation and then,
Hmm.
going
Hmm.
on to the general, because just by virtue of the fact that you got more people moving through in the primary, it's not a one to one. And then a lot of people have argued for ranked choice with the thinking that it, you know, boosts moderation, that it gets people to be less kind of ideologically coalesce behind one person, all that kind of stuff. And while I think that's like a super intriguing idea, I do think what you just said tempers our ability to draw that conclusion, kind of just from Alaska, just because
Right.
Trump, like you said, it's just Trump's grip there is not as strong as it is on other red states. And they do have this kind of like independent streak, and it's an idiosyncratic place. So it's hard to draw that
Very,
conclusion.
very.
But I do think it's an interesting kind of test case. And it'll be interesting as we see more elections in this model. Because so far we've only had, I think Maine is the only other one that's done their Senate races ranked choice. So we don't have
Well,
a big pool of data yet.
I think I saw my friend Amy Walter, who runs the Cook Political Report now. Um, I I think I saw her say on Twitter this morning, and if I'm getting this wrong, it's not Amy's fault; it's my fault. That uh, the two impeachment Republicans who've made it, at
Hmm.
least so far, were both in ranked choice, or either ranked choice or jungle primary, the
That's right. Yeah.
non-traditional setups. And that is kind of, it's, it's funny. I mean, and there's so there's two things, and they kind of have some relationship to each other. There's the jungle primary model, where the primary is just everybody runs
Hmm.
in one big race, and the top two go on to the general. And often in California, that ends up being, you have two Democrats running against each other. In Republican states, the opposite. Ranked choice is obviously a little more complex, but it has some similar dynamics in what it can, it does the current setup, you know, giving advantage to moderates, or moderation, is, it's a very loaded term. What does that mean
Hmm.
exactly, right? Um, but you do have this setup where, in up until very recently, and some of that has to do with just idiosyncrasies within New York politics, but it's basically like, I didn't really have a vote, because like we're all Democrats in the state. And so kind of politics in a way kind of ceases, electoral politics ceases to happen. I mean, it's an extreme case and it's not directly relevant to this, but when I vote in New York State, I got kind of used to the fact that you go down through like congressperson, city council, blah 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 blah, all the different things. None of them are really contested, because again, we're all Democrats, and someone's the incumbent and they're going to win, right? Um, and then you have like judicial races, and at least where I live in Manhattan, you'd have this thing where kind of like, all right, here are six, the six people running for this judge thing, and I don't even know quite what they're judges of, and pick your favorite six. Literally, we're literally, there's no there, you have six choices and you pick six. There's no one even running against, right? So democratic politics does kind of break down in our model when you have this kind of polarization, and to the extent it creates some flexibility and continuation of electoral politics, even when people in a state tend to be Republican or tend to be Democratic. That's a positive.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm intrigued by this idea too, because you mentioned the two House data points we have on the impeachment front. What's interesting to me about that is like those two, who of course I'm forgetting their names off the top, but they were just
I think
one.
Valdayo or
Yeah,
so,
that's
yes, is
definitely
one of
one.
them, and yeah, I can't remember the other.
But I mean, this kind of speaks to what I was going to say, which is that they are not the most memorable of the body that kind of took this big stand. I'm sure if you kind of did the data out about who got the most media attention of this group, obviously you've got Cheney, and then you've got like Kinzinger, kind of people that everyone knows did this. And I do wonder, that's another kind of diluting factor that makes me still kind of be intrigued, but we need more data for this point. Is just, I do think part of this is like, if Trump hasn't made these specific people a huge enemy that he goes after all the time, they just become a little less tarred by that brush than people like Cheney, who it's become her whole political persona, you know?
Right. I mean, although, over the last 6 months, I keep see him popping up. We're like, oh, another one of them went
That's
down.
true. Yeah.
So it's, kind of like where I'm like, oh, I didn't even know there was a primary,
Yeah.
right? Like I wasn't even paying attention. But he's paying attention. And,
Mhm.
the Cheney thing is, I've never know how to pronounce that guy's name. Is it Major, the guy who went down a week or
Oh,
two
yeah.
ago in Michigan? Who, the one who got a lot of attention over Democrats amplifying,
Mhm.
crazies, all that kind of stuff. One of the things about Cheney is, pretty much all those other people, they voted for impeachment, which again was pretty soon after Jan 6th, right? But most of them voted for that. And then they're back to kind of like, oh, Jan 6th committee, fuck that, man. No, no, no more Russia, Russia, Russia. So basically, they didn't disavow their impeachment vote in the cases at least I'm familiar with, but they went out of their way not to talk about it and voted in ways subsequent to that to really try to get back in everybody's good graces. Really, really try. And Liz Cheney, I mean, she's literally, I mean, she's not running it. And I think even there's a lot of Democrats who over the last few months been saying, wow, we got to learn from Liz Cheney. She's up there kind of showing how it's done. Well, I give her plenty of credit, but that's by design. The Democrats up there, the people running that committee, they all realize that it is good for them to have a
Mhm.
Republican leading the charge. But she is, nonstop, just being like nationally prominent and just like bashing Trump like crazy.
Yeah.
So like she's all in, and these others were not all in and like Kinzinger's was kind of all in, and he dropped out because obviously he was not gonna. That's just not. That is not. That's not plausible in the GOP today. But back to the rank. I mean the problem in a lot of ways with our first past the post uh, structured two-party system. And again, everybody talks about the two-party duopoly. It's not a two-party. The constitutional structure sort of forces that. But even within that, you do get in the present hyper partisanized climate, you do get this thing where in a red state, you are basically locked in to the decisions of the 30% of the red group of people.
Mhm.
So like I think what you saw in like Kansas is a good example, although it was not a strictly speaking partisan election, that when it just kind of like, okay, what do we all actually think here? Not does, because you've got this setup where the low turnout electorate in a Republican primary determines who the Republican candidate is, and then the Republicans are going to vote for that person because they're not going to vote for the Democrat. But that's not really necessarily where the whole state GOP is, and it's
Right.
certainly not where the whole state is. So you do get this kind of, it's not even, I think even voting on saying it's people who are extreme is not so much the point, that a lot of people are just locked out of, in a sense, kind of structurally locked out of actual participation in electoral politics because of that structure, because they don't really get a choice.
Right.
And
Totally. Oh, good.
oh, I was just saying, and they're even in a hyper partisanized era, there are going to be some issues where some Republicans or some Democrats, like, yeah, I agree with there's this slice of the people on the other side I kind of agree with. You saw that with abortion,
Right.
where a lot of Republicans are like, I'm very Republican, but on this, like, there's a lot of Democrats who I agree with. So let's just kind of, you know, let's have a kind of an ad hoc.
Hmm.
agreement on abortion. It changes things. So it does seem like it is the next thing. I
Yeah.
expect it to be, to keep spreading around the country.
Totally. Okay, so let's talk about the other Alaska race, which is actually races, because Don Young, who is like the longest serving representative in the House, he died in March. So there has been a special election to fill the end of his term, just the last few months. And then parallel, there is the race for the next full term for this seat. And both of those appeared side by side on the same ballot in Alaska last night. And the reason that this race has kind of attracted attention initially is, as you previewed in the intro, Josh, Sarah Palin is mounting this like kind of initially out of nowhere comeback bid. She hasn't held office for like a decade at this point. And she stepped down from the governorship in 2009 to kind of go pursue other endeavors such as the one season reality show Sarah Palin's Alaska.
And just to remind everybody, we don't mean she declined to run for reelection. She resigned in the middle of her term, which is frankly bizarre. Who does
Yep.
that? Who's not, unless you're going to be indicted or something like that.
Right. So last night was the general election for filling the rest of the partial term. And the last three people in that race are Palin, Nick Bakage, who is in part of the family that you actually referenced earlier, who is like this big Democratic powerhouse
Is he
family.
related? I wasn't sure about
He is
that.
related, yeah.
Okay, interesting. But I
But
guess
he,
distantly related, maybe
yeah.
not like from the primary.
Well, I think he's the grandson of Mark.
Well, so there's Mark Sr., who's the guy who died in a plane crash like 50 years ago.
Uh
There's
huh.
Mark Begich Jr., who is the guy who was senator for one term, like 10 years ago, something like that. I think
Mm
I have this right. And and this guy, who I guess is, maybe closer to your age than my age,
hmm.
pretty young. I have no idea. I have no
Right.
idea whether they're related or not.
So
But the key is,
he is the
sorry, go ahead.
grandson of the one who died in the plane crash, who
Interest.
held this
Okay,
seat before.
but not the son of the senator guy, who's the son of that guy. At least I think
Oh
must be
man,
another.
we're gonna have
Yeah,
to like sketch out of, and they all have the
yeah,
same friggin' names because of the naming your children after you thing.
yeah.
But
In any case, but
he
he's
is a
a
Republican
Republican. Yeah.
scion of this big Democratic family in Alaska. So those are your two Republicans, and then you've got Mary Peltola for the Democrats, who is a former state rep. She would be the first Alaskan native to serve in the congressional delegation. So these are the final three. There was also Al Gross, who we might remember as running for Senate in 2020,
Mm.
and he's an independent. He was running with the Democrats. He became really interesting for like a second because it was the only race that wasn't, it was like the only outstanding race before we had the Georgia runoffs, and there was some
Oh, okay.
speculation of like, could he pull off a wild card win, but he did not.
Right, 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 right.
And he
Okay,
ended up dropping out of this general election for the partial term, I assume, because he didn't want to kind of weaken Peltola, who is the kind of, doing better as the Democratic candidate.
right,
So
right.
we've got these three. Um, and Palin and Bakich have just been going after each other to the almost complete exclusion of going after the Democrat at all. Um,
Now, is he putting himself as another Trumper, or is he in some sense uh, ceding the Trump clone thing to Palin, or how? What is the basis of that?
well,
Because
that's a good.
she's fully on the Trump train, like she's like got the the laying on of hand. I guess I shouldn't call it laying on of hands with Trump. It has has a bad meaning. But the symbolic
Mhm.
anointing or whatever.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, he interestingly, he like used to actually work for Don Young, um, but then kind of tried to shed that and like tack to the right. I mean,
Interesting.
Palin has the Trump endorsement, but she's been kind of calling him, Rhino, blah blah blah, and he's
Okay.
been really hitting her on the like. she's a quitter. She left Alaska to go find fame and fortune.
Right.
That's kind of defined their stuff. And then the Democrat
Interesting.
is just sitting there like, okay, I'll just do my thing. And now, so the general for that was last night. That is ranked choice. And everyone pretty much expected the Democrat to be in first place after that initial tabulation because the Republican votes are being split between the other two. But the thinking is because these two Republicans have basically run elections that are so stupid for ranked choice voting, like making each other radioactive for their voters. So basically making their voters not want to put the other Republican in second place. We are now facing a situation where there's a chance that the Democrat could just squeak through and win because they've riven the Republican voting body so starkly.
And just so we just to kind of take out the gist here, what you're saying is that most people expect that the Democrat will win outright this kind of last 2 or 3 months or 4 or 5 months or whatever of Don Young's term. That's kind of, we're kind of assuming that the Democrat is more than likely to win that. But you're saying that in addition to that, this kind of quirk of ranked choice voting may allow her to win the next term too, because the Republicans are so split.
Oh, so not exactly. What I'm saying basically is that right now, the only ranked choice we have right now is for the partial term. In
Right.
terms
Okay.
of the next full term, we're still only on the primary level, which is that top four candidates go through.
Right.
So
Okay.
we're going to have a redux of this whole thing in November when we get to the general for the full term. But in
Right.
terms of
Okay.
the partial term, this is what people had their eye on as potentially the Democrat cleaning up thanks to the stupid Republican campaigning.
Right.
And I don't think anyone thinks that the Democrat is like a shoe in. I think most people, Alaska is notoriously difficult to poll. And this is like one House seat special election. So there's been basically nothing. But
Right.
I think odds makers kind of thought that Begich would probably win because Palin has made herself so radioactive to Alaskans and has basically spent no time campaigning in the state on top of all these accusations of, her hightailing it out of there when it became
Right.
kind of convenient for her political fortunes.
Right.
But, now we're just facing a potential world where people thought that if Begich comes in third and is the one who kind of gets kicked off in ranked choice voting, and then his second place votes are redistributed, that might end up helping the Democrat because people really don't like Palin. And
Well, even apart from ranked choice voting, if I mean, it's not that there are Democrats in Alaska. So
Mhm.
if Palin and Begich are splitting the Republican vote, isn't it possible that the Democrat would get the most? Would get like 39 or 38% of the vote, and that's the most. She would win on first. Win the plurality on the first round voting.
Yeah, but you have to exceed 50% to win outright before they start doing redistribution of the last person's votes.
Okay, got it.
And
Okay,
she's
so
unlikely to hit that high of a threshold.
right. Okay, so and then one has to assume that a lot of the Republicans put her second choice
Yeah, I
because
mean,
they hate the
that
other
would just
person.
be a really funny end result of these Republicans running a pretty dumb campaign against each other.
Right.
And it's
Right. Right.
interesting because also the DCCC has just not invested in her race at all. And she's mad about it. Like she described it to the Washington Post as, a bizarre decision. But you can also see a world where like the D trip might be kind of keeping their powder dry and not wanting to go all in on like a partial term race and
Yeah,
might be waiting.
I mean, I guess the candidate's point would be, both are happening at the same time, so there's no distinction. But to the
Hmm.
extent that you can hive it off, there is no point in that. Why would they invest
Right.
in, they're not going to not be in the majority for, before 2023.
Right.
Um, the one thing that is worth raising here, um, is that Don Young, the state has one representative, and Don Young was that representative for almost the entire history of the state. I believe he was in for more than 50 years. So he was probably elected for the first time in the very early 70s, or maybe even earlier than that. I don't know precisely. But remember, I believe Alaska became a state in 1959. So, like, they've only, in practice, they've only ever had one member of the House, and that was Don Young. So, like, there's just no press. We have no idea how that, you know, um, we can figure it's sort of, like in a lot of small states, it probably has similar dynamic to how the Senate contest runs. But again, it is worth noting that the place has had one representative
Yeah.
for its entire history. I'm kind of curious when he was, and Don Young is also another good kind of example of a Republican, and in some ways very conservative, but less conservative than just weird and like cantankerous, and very focused on getting spending for his state. And people call that pork, but again, you've got a state out in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic. It needs a lot of federal support.
Yeah.
I looked here, and it seems like he was first elected in 1972, and notably, and this is all right. This is where it comes full circle. Who was he preceded by? He was preceded by Nick Begich,
There we
the
go.
guy who died in the plane crash.
Mm-hmm.
And there was someone else who wait, it was wait, is it there was someone I mean it's I Ted Stevens died in a plane crash, right? I mean, they've got this thing where they use planes as kind of like cars, right? And it's they crash. You have tiny little planes going around. Who was it? There was that other guy. Was it Hale Boggs? Oh yeah, um, that Hale Boggs, who was this kind of the House Majority Leader from Louisiana, who God, I'm sort of winging it here. I believe was Cokie Roberts' brother. Do I have that right? Or maybe it's one generation off. They're all from the Boggs family. This big Louisiana political family. He was also killed in that crash. So you have. Let me just kind of bring it full. Wait, in office. Oh, I guess. Wait, who? He didn't have it the whole time. He was only in office for like 1 year, and then before him was this guy Howard Pollock. Um, I guess they actually had a decent amount, in that one pre-Don Young decade. They had a
Lots of
lot of
turnover.
turnover. Yeah, well, because they had Begich, and then I went to the guy before him who was named Howard Pollock. This is real time research here. He only goes back to elected in 1966, and then you have Ralph Rivers, a Democrat. Maybe he's the only. Maybe this is the only. Or I guess
Wowee.
Begich was the Democrat. Um, he was the first guy, and he was actually, how like they've got a sort of a delegate from
Mm.
DC. He
Mm-hmm.
was even the delegate when it was still a territory. Even though I've obviously gone pretty far down the rabbit hole, so let me unpack it, Kate, and
So now,
bring us
as we
back.
scramble out of the
Yeah,
rabbit hole,
yeah,
let's do a
yeah.
quick pass around this report that the Republican campaign arm is basically like pulling back in some pretty key states from the Senate point of view. And the article mentioned Pennsylvania and Arizona and Wisconsin. And Josh, I know you did like an ed blog about this. So what did you see about the kind of particulars about that reporting, and what can we conclude from it?
Well, you have the NRSC, the Republican Senate campaign committee, who is sort of the top strategic arm of doing this stuff. They when you run these committees, you have to reserve time in advance, television ad time in advance. And they went into those three states and pulled out a lot of their ad buys. Um, Now, some of this can get mixed up with how the campaign finance system works. Some kinds of committees can do completely unregulated spending, some
Hmm.
does more regulated. Some of them are these joint committees where the committee can spend a lot, but they need the campaign to spend, to pick up a certain percentage. So there's all these different factors going on. And of course, the campaign committee say, "Oh, no, 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 this is just kind of bookkeeping. We're going to put all that back and blah 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 blah." There seem to be a few different things happening. One is that Herschel Walker and Mehmet Oz are both doing terribly in fundraising, and they don't have enough money in some cases to join these hybrid buys. But I think the big thing is that, like certainly in Pennsylvania and Arizona, it really looks like the Republican candidates are toast. We're told this is like a Republican wave year, and they're both consistently 10 points behind the Democrat. And the Democrat in both cases is just over 50%. So, as often happens, if you're in charge of electing as many Republicans as possible, you look at it at a certain point, and you're like, those guys are toast. We have to, we're not going to spend good money after bad. Um, and you have so it's a mix. We don't know exactly, and there's an element. There's the potential for wishful thinking for Democrats here to think that they're really kind of cutting off these candidates. I don't think they're cutting off these candidates, but they're retrenching with
Hmm.
those candidates, because again, in those two cases, again, when you're 10 points behind, that's bad. That's really bad. And uh, in that case, now Wisconsin is much less clear to me. I expect that to be a very hard fought race. There's very little good polling so far
Hmm.
because the Democrat was only chosen. And even after that person's chosen, when you have a primary battle, you need the kind of the hard feelings to kind of shake out there, and the other party to kind of coalesce. And Ron Johnson, uh, whatever you can say about him, he is demonstrably a great electoral politician. There's no question. No one expected him to beat Russ Feingold. No one expected him to beat him on the rematch. He beat him both times. The guy is a very canny politician. But they seem to have pulled back from there a bit too, which that surprised me. And I think the broader context here is that, kind of semi out of the glare of the national media, the uh, candidate in North Carolina is basically tied with the Republican.
Hmm.
And you know, that's a state that, is a Republican leaning state. Democrats have had their hearts broken there on Senate races a lot recently. So I'm not saying that she's going to win. I'm forgetting the candidate's last name.
Beasley,
Um,
right?
Sherry Beasley. I'm not saying she's going to win, but when you're tied like that, the Republicans need to fight for that. And bizarrely, you've got polls out of Florida now that show a real race between Val Demings and Marco Rubio. Now, again, Florida, the ultimate broken heart state for Democrats. Um, but when you have races that are looked to be tied in the polls, you've got to spend to defend those seats. So I think, big picture, what we see here is Republicans getting a sense of the lay of the land in the late summer, seeing that a number of states they thought were pickups are looking like a real challenge, and other states they thought were basically in hand, they're going to have to fight to defend. And they're moving money, you know, in line with that, thinking.
Yeah, no, totally. And just to add one case to that also, I mean, in Ohio, the 538 kind of amalgamation of all the polls has Tim Bryan up like 4.5 points on JD Vance. I mean, talk about a state that like Republicans expect that to fall into their category, you know?
And that is an example that is not you know, Kate is not talking about one poll there. With that state has been polled a lot over the last 2 months, and Ryan has consistently been either tied or ahead of JD Vance. Like it there's a lot of polling data there, and neither is an incumbent, but it's a Republican state. So when you've got so the Republican is in a sense the incumbent because it's a Republican state,
Right.
and that I don't know what to think there exactly because like right now I'm looking at the poll average that 538 has. Remember that's Nate Silver's site. And it's basically Vance 41, Ryan 46, or actually 45.8. Now, that looks pretty good to me. I really like how that looks. And I will say this, as much as Tim Ryan has annoyed a lot of Democrats across the country over the last 20 years, I literally think there is no one in Ohio who is better positioned to win as a Democrat in that state. He's the perfect candidate for that state. Um, doesn't mean he's going to win, but he's the perfect candidate, and he's running a great campaign. Now, when I look at those numbers from an adverse point of view, what I see there is that you've got a good dozen percent of the electorate uncommitted. And when you have that, that leaves a lot of space for partisan muscle memory to kick in, to people saying, I think Vance is an idiot, but look, I'm a Republican and it's control the Senate. So you have to figure there's a lot of the undecideds are going to break against Ryan. But again, that's sort of the devil's advocate position. The main thing is like, what the fuck? How is it possible that the Democrat is not only in this race, but is actually like opening up not a huge, but a significant and seemingly persistent lead? Who
Totally. I
knows?
mean, it's Ohio. It's not I don't even I don't think people would even really consider Ohio like a purple state anymore, I mean, it's pretty consistently just been going Republican in all, recent cycles.
Yeah, no, and it's funny that the certainly as recently as like 2004 and
Mhm.
2008, Democrats were still in, that's still a Democratic state. Or
Yep.
no one was saying it was a Democratic state. It has been for more than a century. It has been a kind of a classic bellwether, right?
Mhm.
There's even that statistic like, only a few presidents have won the presidency without winning Ohio, all that kind of stuff. Um, but it is there is something that has happened basically over the last decade, especially in the Trump era, where Ohio has gone from being a bellwether to, Democrats saying we're not on a bad streak. Like it's a Republican state now,
Yep.
and it's trending in a Republican direction. And the one thing I would say is that I mean, there's two dynamics here. Part of it is this is what I mean by if you're going to run anybody, you run Tim Ryan because he's got he's I think he's from Youngstown. I think that's the district he's from. He's kind of rooted in union politics, industrial labor union politics in that city, a kind of an older version of the Democratic Party, basically. But culturally, he's got that thing, and that's native to him, right? And I've seen a lot of people saying, Republicans saying, "Oh, he's running as a Trumper." Well, not really. That kind of like male union, you know, good old boy thing that precedes Trumpism. That's not Trump didn't invent that. A lot of the Ohio Democratic Party comes out of that kind of thing originally. So Ryan has always kind of been from that place politically. He's also running heavily on choice, which sort of shows you the evolution of choice politics
Totally.
in recent years. And but also Sherrod Brown won re-election. I think he was up in 2018. Can't remember exactly. So there's still a lane for those kind of. I mean, Sherrod Brown's a very different kind of politician, but there's that lane. But here's the other thing, and this is will hopefully justify this very long-winded answer. Um, JD Vance. Here's the thing with JD Vance. A lot of a lot of people now look back on the Obama Romney era and say, it wasn't the it wasn't the Democrats were doing as well as you think. It was that Republicans ran this kind of out of touch Richie as their guy. And Democrats were able to kind of run against him as an out of touch Richie, right? Now, for better or worse, we know that Trump can just come at that from a different angle. He comes from a very different cultural politics. I think the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for Republicans here is that Vance, even though I think Mitt Romney is a much better person than JD Vance, they're kind of playing into that Romney thing here. He is an out of touch Richie who left Ohio, you know, does all the kind of, private equity, sending your jobs overseas kind of thing. And that, so he is, as much as Ryan is sort of the perfect Democrat to run in that state, that Vance has, it may turn out to have vulnerabilities kind of on the Romney line that people did not quite figure in here. But who knows?
Did you see that one picture that his campaign tweeted? I think last week, maybe early this week, of like, it was just the candidate sitting down having some meetings, but he was in this like lavishly decorated parlor that had like a chandelier in the shot. And it's almost along the lines of like that video of Oz that's gone viral this week of him shopping for the world's weirdest, quote unquote, crudité tray, which is
Right.
like, does someone on your campaign hate you? Like, who let this see the light of day?
It I did not see that, but it does seem uh it does seem very par for the course. I mean, as we know, as has spent most of his public life, telling us, Vance came from a working class sort of, troubled working class
Mhm.
background. But clearly, he has shed that skin as an adult, right? And so, yeah, he's not going to be like kind of like working the phones in his mobile home, right? Of course not, because he's a rich guy and he's
Yeah.
like Peter Thiel's best bud. So, and it's kind of one of these things where you it's hard. It can be very hard for a candidate to manage that because on the one hand, yeah, you don't want to be there, um, in your drawing room with your chandelier and all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, you don't want to do what Oz did and literally be there like kind of like I'm here in my mobile home. Hey, honey, kick the air conditioner. It's too loud. Because then you're gonna just seem like you're just full of it and an idiot. So it it's hard if you're trying to certain politicians are able to basically say, yeah, I'm really rich. I've been really successful. And now I want to kind of, they all say some version of, now I want to give back.
Mm.
I want to kind of help improve this country. I'm not going to lie to you. I am rich. I've done very well. And, if you can do that, but it's a hard, it can be a hard balance to strike, particularly if you're JD Vance, it would seem,
Yeah,
or Mehmet Oz. And
exactly.
one other, and God, I'm endless here, and I apologize to everybody. One final point, and this is their someone was saying something recently about, oh, celebrity candidates hurting Republicans. It's not only celebrity candidates; it's more candidates Trump picked.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing about that is real. Running for office is not easy. You don't want to do it the first time as a senator. When you're a big national race, it takes practice. And some people, as we have seen, are naturals. Most people are not naturals. And I do think that is kind of what you're seeing here with JD Vance and Mehmet Oz, that it's not that easy. It takes some practice, and they do not have practice, and they're heading out onto the ice rink and their first time on skates, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So let's do a real quick kind of just give us a little update corner on what's happened with Radiolago since we last checked in last week. I
Yeah,
think
I
we
yeah.
got the warrant, right?
We got the warrant, we got the inventory,
Yep.
which and critically, those are things that the target of the search gets on day one.
Mm-hmm.
There's some extreme, very rare exceptions to that, but those are kind of you're entitled to. So those are the things that Trump could have released on his own on day one, and then the judge um, ordered those released. I think Trump actually did leak them, like half hour before they were released,
Yeah,
and
and leaked the names of the FBI agents who
yeah,
carried out the search.
exactly. And now the judge is deciding whether to release the affidavit.
Mhm.
And the affidavit is really that when you go to the judge and ask for the warrant, the affidavit is where the real story is. Here's what we are trying to do. Here's what we're trying to prove. Here's why we think it's really serious. So it really kind of gives you the narrative with a lot of the juice. And I think the government is basically saying, dude, no way. You're gonna blow up our case. You're gonna tell Trump what our strategy is. You're gonna out our witnesses. Don't do it. And I think the pretty strong assumption is that the judge will either refuse to do it or will do it with so many redactions that it kind of is meaningless. And that is sort of where it is. And you've had a sort of a cavalcade of different excuses, rationales from Trump, standing order, double secret declassification, kind of everything under the sun. And that's just kind of where it is now.
So is there any kind of concrete next step we're waiting for? It sounds like, if we get the affidavit in any form, it's not going to be super, revelatory. So what are we just kind of in limbo until more of a case develops or?
I think that is basically right. Um, there's always the chance that reporters will reveal more aspects of what is going on. But in terms of the legal process, I think that the government seems to have what it wants, and either and I don't think there's not a next step until they decide to do something, and that could. I'm not sure there's a lot that would be besides an indictment or not an
Mm,
indictment. And
right.
and and one other kind of part of this is that there are still kind of two theories of what happened here. One
Hmm.
is that this search was basically primarily about proving a crime, or an investigation pointing in that direction. Or the other was just like the stuff was so sensitive they had to get it back right away. And that trying to indict anyone was secondary and maybe not something they've really ever have focused on or are likely to do. It's just that they could not, they absolutely could not leave the stuff there. So it's quite possible, or it's at least there's one reasonable theory of this, that this was just to kind of protect some very secret information, and indicting the president has never been in the cards. So I think we could remain in limbo for quite some time, because obviously, as one, I think, as we all know, if the idea is here to indict the president for a crime, you are going to want to get that thing as like tied up as absolutely as tight as possible. You don't want to, the whole thing. You strike the king, you kill him. You don't end up
Mm-hmm.
with some kind of like dangling threads that he's able to wriggle his way out of. And as much as a prosecutor should kind of, call the case on its merits, this is inherently political, in the sense that you really don't want to, if you were going to bring a serious criminal charge against a former president, you want the case to be strong enough where no one can reasonably say you're just playing politics. They don't have to agree that he should be convicted, but it has to be kind of like, okay, this is really serious. You kind
Mm-hmm.
of had to act. So I don't I think this specifically is going to hang out there for a while. But it's also true that there's like 20 other investigations of
Right.
Trump, so it's entirely possible that one or more of them will pop up with something like in the near future.
Right. All right.
All right. Well, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. Go to Grady'sColdBrew.com. Get 25% off with your promo code TPM.
All right. We'll see you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Hansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.